Came across a report today on MSN News. That is one of the news features that comes up when you log into your email. Uh, from the Daily Telegraph, it was about the childhood home of David Lloyd George, the great World War One Prime Minister, um, and the Labour government in Wales um, trying to decolonise it. Uh, I don't have the original Daily Telegraph piece because it's a paywall, so I'm going to the other source, which is GB News. I don't want to say anything I've said about GB News, by the way, but they're the only other source reporting this. The truth is, this sort of thing is so common that it's barely even used anymore. I think it is a problem. Just to lay my cards on the table, I think it's absolutely ridiculous. This report is by James Saunders. First World War Prime Minister David Lloyd George's childhood home is said to be decolonised in a Welsh Labour-led diversity push. Though Lloyd George was born in Manchester, the cottage in which he grew up in rural Wales has been converted into a museum, but now it has been folded into a taxpayer-funded nationwide anti-racist drive. Scrolling down. The museum in tiny Clanny Stundway, hope I'm pronouncing that correct. I think in Welsh the two L's is a cl sound, so I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Which honours Britain's World War One leader, has already worked with a decolonisation consultant to change its approach to history, while LGBT displays have also been penciled in for future exhibitions as it undergoes modernisation and reinterpretation works. Reinterpretation works, says it all. Just going down. The anti-colonial consultancy has been paid for by Welsh Government grants for museums to conduct work which will supposedly set the right historic narrative and promote a multicultural, vibrant and diverse Wales. But the plans have come under fire, not least from Conservative commentator Ian Dale, who lamented how this country is slowly going insane. Staff at Gwynedd Council Museums, which runs the Lloyd George site, have also been handed anti-racist Welsh Government training as part of the same programme to alter how history is presented. Now the taxpayer cash will be directed to updating and modernising displays inside the museum, which comprises two sites, a main gallery building, as well as the cottage in which future hero of Wales and only Welsh PM Lloyd George was raised. There is not yet a plan for any new displays on famed Boer War opponent Lloyd George. Those working on the project are understood to be advocating for more black and minority ethnic stories to be told. It's understood that consultancy was provided by RE Collections, an anti-racist project run by the Association of Independent Museums, which has been awarded grant funding by the Welsh Government. RE Collections advises museums to ensure that BAME perspectives and experiences are treated as a natural part of the histories that museums document and explore. It also urges museums to ensure that collections, activities and exhibitions present a greater diversity of BAME perspectives, histories and experiences. Meanwhile, the local Plaid Cymru run council's museum service has indicated that if we come across any LGBT histories connected to the story we tell, they would also be included in future displays. The plot to reassess history at Lloyd George's former home is part of a broad programme by the Welsh Government to ensure libraries, galleries, museums and public artworks are anti-racist and present the correct historical narratives. An anti-racist Wales culture, heritage and sport fund has been set up to support this work. Under it, organisations will be able to claim as much as £15,000 in grant funding for each anti-racist scheme. And of course my computer is going to freeze as I'm trying to scroll this down. Very annoying. Well, while that sorts itself out, it's that thing where the screen freezes. That is basically the gist of it anyway. I think it's near the end of the report. Um, you know, I really think this is just symbolic of something we've seen in recent years, certainly throughout the 2020s, but I'd say probably beginning in the late 2000s, but particularly in the late 2010s onwards, this puritanical woke agenda. And that's how I describe it because it seems that there's absolutely nothing they will not touch in terms of revisionism, in terms of trying to purify British history. Now, a museum that is around the childhood home of one of our greatest statesmen should be primarily focused on David Lloyd George, his life and his times, the society that he was in, the politics that he was involved with, pros and cons. I have no problem, by the way, with including BA perspectives if it directly relates to Lloyd George's policy. So, for example, as the report says, he opposed the Anglo-Boer War, the Second Anglo-Boer War, along with the other Liberal leaders, Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman. And incidentally, they took a big political risk in doing so, as you know, the Tories really pushed that in the khaki election of 1900 um, or 1902. But so if you were to include, for example, a perspective of Black South Africans in the context of that, that would be relevant. Although actually the victims of the infamous British concentration camps were white or women and children, it was certainly one of the stains on our imperial legacy. I have no problem with that being included. That is something we should be honest about. British concentration camps in the Second Boer War. But this isn't about that. This seems to be just about injecting 21st century dogma into everything. Now, the LGBT thing, for example, what the hell has a pride flag got to do with David Lloyd George's legacy, for example? That might make sense in a museum dedicated to Alan Turing, for instance. Although even there, the focus would be on his scientific and technological breakthroughs. I think most people would be opposed to this because it's patronizing to LGBT people, to minority people. Um, it's just got no relevance, no direct relevance. I can understand it in a museum dedicated exclusively to those things, but this sort of Puritan drive to inject it into everything, I really have a big problem with this notion of decolonization. Fact of the matter is, the British Empire was the largest empire in history. We were the global hegemony in the 19th century. So you're going to find aspects of empire everywhere. But trying to purify that, trying to shame our history and shame the figures in our history. I mean, if anything, Lloyd George's anti-imperialism, the Boer War is the example of that. In contrast to, for example, the Liberal Prime Minister Lord Rosebery, who supported Lord Salisbury, the Tory Prime Minister of the time, in the Second Anglo-Boer War. But David Lloyd George led us through the second half of the First World War. He laid the foundations in the People's Budget of 1909 to the modern welfare state. He's rightly regarded as one of our greatest leaders. And this is yet another hard left attempt to just, it comes from, of course, the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. It's just this attempt to purify everything. And I am sick of it. I am wholly sick of it. This is not a case of, being bombastic and saying all our history was wonderful and we didn't have darker aspects of our history. I'm fine with talking about that stuff. It's just this Puritan agenda that comes from the woke left. In this case, it's a Labour government that's supported by Plaid Cymru. It's pathetic. And I just think it's diversity for diversity's sake. I mean, they're talking about injecting LGBT stuff into this. What has LGBT? I mean, Lloyd George was heterosexual. He was famously a womanizer. It's got nothing to do with his premiership. Um, and homosexuality wasn't decriminalised in this country to 1967. That might actually make sense in a museum about Harold Wilson because that would be something relevant to his premiership. You know, um, that is an example of just trying to inject 21st century dogma into that. Of course, there were excuse me, LGBT people in Lloyd George's day, but it's not got any direct relevance to his policies, um, because it just doesn't. Um, I just think, I mean, this is far from a unique case. We're seeing this across the board from left wing councils. Of course, now we have a Labour government. We're probably going to see more of it. Um, Keir Starmer may not be the far left brand of politics that his predecessor was, but he's definitely woke. and his track record is pandering to the woke. I think it was an absolute disgrace that Starmer took the knee that time. Um, because Black Lives Matter has proven itself to be a very divisive and arguably racist movement. I say arguably racist because they have had spokespeople coming out with blatantly racist anti-white rants. Um, it's a disgrace. So just to conclude, I don't say that we should sanitize our history. I don't say we should present all of our history as glorious and perfect. And I've no problem. Let's look at the injustices in our history, but let's do it in a proportionate way. What I really have a problem with is this really puritan. It kind of reminds me of the Red Guards in communist China. Absence of violence. There isn't like they're not beating people to death, so it's not that extreme. But it is that sort of puritanical revisionism. It is that sort of this is bad history. Let's just decolonize it. There was part of that that struck me. Yes, the present correct historical narrative. Who the hell gets to decide what's a correct historical narrative? If we're truly to be, an open society that looks honestly at our past, then there should be debate on it. There should be a candid reflection on it. That means both sides, positive and negative. But the woke left only want to look at the negative. They want to shame our history. Um, I am so wholly sick of it. There was another agenda. I was reading Neil Ferguson's book on empire. Um, and it got me looking up um, Cecil Rhodes' legacy. Now, Rhodes was an absolute racist, let's be honest about it, he was, but hugely influential figure, and there's the famous Cecil Rhodes Scholarship in Oxford. Um, well, apparently in the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a project called Uncomfortable History, which was started in Oxford, but it's now went to other cities, I believe York and a few others, to look at the uncomfortable colonial legacies of our history. Again, this just looks like Puritanism. It looks like just trying to find the negatives in our history for the sake of it. Um, I certainly wouldn't agree with the other narrative. I mean, take for example Churchill. There will be some conservatives and some on the right who will not accept any criticism of Churchill. I don't agree with that. I think historic figures all deserve valid scrutiny. I mean, Lloyd George had his faults. Lloyd George's attitude to the Third Reich, for example, was very dubious in the 1930s. He did have a historically regressive attitude to that. But he was a great leader, and he led us through the second half of the First World War after the munitions crisis of 1916. Um, he's rightly regarded as among our best. So just nothing is sacred. I mean, his childhood home should be primarily focused on his premiership, his life, and the socio-politics of his day. That should be it. Trying to inject, for example, pride flags into the boyhood home of David Lloyd George is absolutely ridiculous. So I agree with the critics, it is ridiculous. And unfortunately, this sort of thing is happening a lot. When are the woke left going to give it a rest? When are they going to stop looking for things to decolonize? Whether it be renaming streets, whether it be tearing down statues. Um, I was watching, this is because there's similar debates in the United States. I was watching an episode of Designated Survivor recently, and I think it's a great series because they're very topical. And they have one episode which is focusing on left wing protesters demanding statues be dragged down, or at least as part of the episode. It isn't the whole synopsis of that episode. But an interesting part of the episode showed an elderly black uh, pastor, and he wasn't in favour of bringing down a statue of a Civil War figure who was a mayor of this was a fictional character, but based on real things, a mayor of a town in Tennessee, because he argued if you tear it down, you're just erasing history. So let's have that history there, so people can know the racism that was involved, rather than just trying to tear it down. My problem with the woke left is they want to absolutely sanitize everything to their dogma, to what they think is right. And it's extremely intolerant. It's only one view of history, and it is injecting 21st century selective dogma. It isn't even 21st century dogma because not everyone agrees with them. They cannot be allowed to speak for all of us. in this era. Um, so it's not the only example. I'll put a link as always. I will put the original Daily Telegraph link. If you open it up, you'll be able to read it once, and then second time round there's a paywall. But check it out. I just think this is pathetic. What I find particularly interesting is, how they hide behind the anti-racist thing and talk about correct historical narrative. I mean, if you're looking at historic figures, certainly I would concede that Cecil Rhodes is a lot more obviously prone to scrutiny of racism than David Lloyd George. Um, but there's no historic figure in our history. I wouldn't be surprised if they target David Livingstone, the great missionary who actually campaigned against slavery. Because nothing, if they're a historic figure, then we have to target them, we have to purify them, we have to inject these standards and this forced dogma onto it. If I was going to a museum about David Lloyd George, I would want to know about, artifacts to do with his life, his policies, his premiership, the First World War, indeed the suffragettes, that would be very relevant to his era. But injecting this other stuff, and this is not if this is one example, you could dismiss it, oh, that's a silly idea. But we're seeing this across the board, and I'm wholly fed up with it. So far as I know, it hasn't been promoted in our local museum here in Sunderland. But Labour Council, I would give it time.